Good morning and welcome to NIPFP and to this event. We are, everybody's talking about the economy, right? And everybody's talking about it every month. Sometimes it's great, and sometimes it's a profusion of information being chucked at one. So it's nice to be able to sit back and think a little bit and try and wrap your heads around what we see, not in a weekly, monthly basis, but in terms of slightly longer periods, and to understand how we see things going forward. And that is broadly the purpose for the session today. And given that we are a public finance institute, we hope to give you some thoughts on how we see the FISC going as well. If I'm asked what I'm looking for, I'm basically trying to understand. Everybody says three things about the economy today. The first is we'll all be worrying about inflation picking up again. We'll be worrying about simultaneously whether we see agricultural outputs going up or going down. There are questions about whether the rainfall is adequate and it is timely in the sense being suitable to the cropping cycle. Rains can be dropped at all inopportune moments and measured adequate but not suitable. So that seems to be one running theme, more so because Ukraine and Russia can't decide how to sort out their issues, and the consequences for world food stocks as well as prices are sustained problematic. The second seems to be issues relating to global headwinds as they're nicely presented, who feel like a bird in the wind. And the idea is that if the global economy is not growing great, do we have difficulties in sustaining economic growth? And how big a challenge is it for India? Are we dependent, and therefore do we see significant impact, or do we see manageable impact? So that, I guess, is the second question that seems to pop up in conversations. And we'd all love to have reassuring answers, but we see how the world decides to play out. So far, I think the FISC has been relatively behaving itself. The last year budget, the RE announcements seem to have held out. So we have some stability on that front. Monthly GST numbers seem to be doing as well as they can do. So we have no major negative shocks coming out of that. CapEx seems to be sustained, and we're all now looking at so-called good balance sheets, both for the banks and for the corporate sector. So any moment now, corporates should start investing. Some of them seem to have started investing. So let's hear from the experts. I'll hand over to Dr. Mandal to take us through the panel discussion so that we are not, we have more engaging conversations instead of long presentations. Over to you, sir.
Thanks, Kavita, and a very good morning to all of you, both those here in the room and those who are joining us remotely, because this is a hybrid format. As Kavita just mentioned in the initial remarks, which I thought were very thoughtful, and as posed questions, I'm not sure the answers will be working. We'll see what the panel has to tell us. But as she mentioned, the format we have changed. Last time we did this about 8 months ago, before the budget. It was a conventional seminar, webinar type of thing. This time we thought we would have a more interactive panel discussion. And after the panel discussion, we hope to have enough time for substantive Q&A session. And that's really, in a sense, very important that those who are attending have a chance to also raise their concerns and get the response to the panel. Let me mention here, for those of you who are joining us online, please register your questions for the Q&A part in the chat box. And it would be nice to also mention your name. We will keep a record of it. And during the Q&A, after going around the room for those who are present here, we will address those questions. So with those, let me mention the panelists. Rani Bhattacharya, Rani Bhattacharya, Manish sitting over there, Radhika, and Dinesh is also part of the team. I'm going to play the role of an anchor. So let's start off by looking at what's happening to growth. One of the questions that Ramesh is asking. So, Radhika, why don't you, I'm sorry, Rudani, why don't you take us through the growth story?
India recorded a robust growth in the during the last financial year of 2023. So in the first half, that strong growth was mainly driven by a strong base effect in the first half of that financial year, because during the first half of the previous year in 21-22. The second wave of COVID, and that had a huge negative impact on the Indian economy, and that creates a strong base effect for the next first half of the next financial year. But we see there is a decline in the growth rate in H2, that is the second half of the financial year, and that decline in that growth rates are reflected. It is due to the trading base effect, and also these are reflected in decline in consumption and investment demand growth. So if we look at the private final consumption expenditure, during the first half, it grew at a rate of 30.6%, which declined to the second half to 2.5%, which is like a kind of 5 times growth. And gross fixed capital formation is also is almost half, a little bit less than. And exports and imports. Imports decline. We see there's significant decline in imports in the second half, but exports decline, but not to the extent that imports decline. Government final consumption expenditure shrinked in the first half, but we see that there is a mild revival during the second. So that's what we see for the.
So given us the story, what's actually happened to growth last financial year and the first and second half, and focused on the demand side of the story. In terms of the supply side, if you will, in terms of growth of subsectors, so which were the sectors that did well, which were sort of lagging behind?
So during the second half, industrial activities was actually driven mainly led by robust performance in construction and utilities. So there are double-digit growth in these two sectors, whereas manufacturing muted during the last financial year. In services, H1 growth was very high. This was again because there is the low base effect in the previous year that has driven up that pushed up the into the first half services growth. But it has halved in the second half, and we see that this decline is mainly in trade, transport, telecom services, and public administration defense services. So these are the two components, two sectors with services that are. agriculture was muted in the first half because of the volatile extreme weather condition. We had extreme rainfall as well as we had the temperature was very high, which affected our wheat production in the first half. But in the second half, we see that there's a robust growth in agriculture, which was driven by the higher soil area in for Rabi crops, mainly under wheat, and that is also driven by the demand for wheat that was there in the global market, which increased the domestic price of wheat. So farmers had an incentive to increase their activities and activities. So that's how in the last half of the last financial year, that's the.
So we ended the year with a very severe slowdown, and that gave us a growth of 7.2% instead of the 9.5% in the first half of the year. But what's happening now? Do we have any reassuring answers to Kavita's question? What's the story?
So actually, the information that we have till the first quarter of this financial year, so we get a very sort of mixed kind of picture. So starting with agriculture, we see that the weather condition is very volatile. So the rainfall deviation from the normal level, which was in the first half, in the months of the first quarter of this financial year, was sometimes very high from the normal level, sometimes very low. So sometimes we are having excessive rainfall, sometimes we are having less than normal rainfall, which are affecting our the cultivation process, as well as excess rainfall creates wastage of crops, which has an impact on agricultural performance as well as on the food prices. So that's kind of it's come to it later. Also, the areas sown till June, the areas sown under Kharif crop are 4% lower than that was there in the last financial year during the same period. So this shows that there can be agriculture may show up. So by the end of the August, we'll get the GDP numbers for this quarter, and we expect that maybe we'll see a muted growth for this sector. And also, if we look, one of the indicators of agricultural domestic growth in domestic sales of tractors, which that it was negative, although revived in the end of this quarter, but it's not the same level as it was during the second half of the last financial year. So these are the indicative
for agriculture. Industry.
Yeah. So now we moving to industry. We see there is an overall recovery in the. We have seen that industrial activities were muted in the last financial year. So we see an overall recovery, but it's mainly driven by construction, which was doing well in the last financial year, but now they are showing a strong growth. That yellow line, the yellow line. The manufacturing, the red line is also showing a recover. It has recovered, but it is mainly driven by the green line, which is the consumer non-durables. So here we see a stark difference that we had India experienced during the COVID period. In COVID period, it is the consumer durables, which is mainly automobile, that has been the engine of manufacturing growth. But now we see that, and it became muted in the last, the demand for this products became muted, and in the last financial year, we found that agriculture was not doing well, manufacturing was not doing well. But now we see that it is consumer non-durables that has picked up. So this is an indicative of the broad-based demand revival that we have seen.
The slowdown that happened in last fiscal was mainly on the services side. So what's happening there? For your services?
Just before going to that, I just want to point out that the end of this quarter, we see there is a little bit flattening of this in the performance of these sectors, which is due to the monetary transmission effect. The monetary tightening happened during the last financial year, but the lag transmission that is happening, that we see right now. So in India, that monetary transmission takes around 2 to 3 quarters to show up. So we see it now. Now to question on services. These are some selective indicators on trade services specifically. So these are the red line is the cargo handle major seaports, which is an indicator of foreign trade. So we see that it was quite high. The growth was almost it was double digit in the second half of the last financial year, but which declined and now it has come down to almost zero. Cargo handled in airports, which is indicator of both domestic and foreign trade services, that was that was negative. The growth in that was negative for the last financial year, but it started picking up. But again, it has gone down. It has come. It's not performing. The domestic trade indicator, the cargo moved in railways, the brown line, that was stable for the last financial year, but now we see that in the first quarter of this financial year, dipping. So there's an indication of that services is going to perform not very well in this quarter, in Q1 this financial year as well.
So all these sort of leading indicators, the agriculture, industry, services, by and large, suggest that the dip in growth that we saw second half of last year is persisting at least in the first quarter of this year. So what are you forecasting for the year as a whole?
We forecast, so it's a range of 5.6 to 6%. So these ranges are based on two alternative models. One is a high frequency nowcasting model where around 18 to 29 indicators are used to extract the information and get the growth number. The other one is based on an annual model using annual data as a focus model annual data. So our projection is a little bit lower than the projections of other organizations like RBI. So we expect this slowdown in financial year to the lagged impact of monetary transmission, which is we have started seeing is having an impact on construction as well as manufacturing. It might persist for a few quarters, 2-3 quarters, and see a negative impact on growth because of that. And also, there is a global growth decline that is predicted by IMF in this year, which is 3%, down from 3.5%. So that is also going to affect India's export and
Yeah, just you mentioned that our forecasts are little lower. Yes, the actual number, but forecasts also distribution. So they're all very closely bunched. 6.2% of IMF, I think 6.2 for the bank, ours at 6%. The official thing of India, I mean, the government and RBI, also marginally higher, but not much higher. So basically, they're sort of constant, very low, around 6%, maybe a little more, little less. So that's the growth story. Should we move to inflation now? What's the outlook there?
So this is the headline inflation. It was above the higher tolerance level of RBI 6% in the last financial year. But in this quarter, it has come down to even before that is during March. It came down within the band. If we look at what are the components which has driven this to the band, back to the band, so we see there is a broad-based decline in all the major components of inflation. So is CPI food, CPI energy, CPI core. So CPI food came below 6% in November last year. CPI energy and core has come down below 6% in April of this year. So this shows this
forecasting is now quite challenging. You get a policy shock, all your forecasts based on past data become kind of, less reliable. And the government has reacted very quickly. It's not that our inflation has gone up to 7-8%. It's just a little, upward, and there's a strong reaction, a strong signal from the RBI, the central government, like is organizing the tomato control price, supply, etc. So anyway, what is your forecast for inflation for the year?
So based on the available information, our forecast is we're going to have 5.1% during the financial year, this financial year. But again, this is a fan chart, so it shows that the range of inflation that we can have at different levels of probability, 68%, 90%. So that range is quite so we can go. And we have upward risk indeed. So as we have already discussed that the weather condition is very volatile and that is going to have an impact on food prices. Also there we have seen the rebound of crude oil prices, global crude oil prices, and the global food supply disruption due to the Ukraine's withdrawal deal. So that these are the upward risks that on their inflation, our inflation. However, as we have said that the monetary policy transmission impact, which is mainly that is not going to affect much on the food and energy prices, but on the core inflation, we might see some moderation.
And the intervention in government's intervention may affect the supply side. Okay, so we've covered the real economy and inflation and so on. What about the external sector? Should we look at that now?
So in the first half, we have a deteriorating current account balance, but in second half, it improved mainly due to decline in merchandise trade deficit and increase in the services of trade surplus. Services trade, increasing the growth of increasing the services trade surplus. And during this period, good imports growth was the decline in good imports was larger than the decline in exports. So that actually caused the decline in trade deficit. We see that this blue bar is the merchandise trade deficit. The orange is the net services inflows. So we have positive net services inflows. But the green segment is the primary income, which is we see that net outflows in it, which means that the foreigners who are earning in India are earning much more. Foreigners in India are earning much more than Indians earning in other countries. So, however, Remittances, the secondary income, the yellow segment, the remittances that is positive, means we have a positive the net inflow of remittances. So there's a lot of people are non-resident Indians are remitting money to India. So that's being affected. So it's not the primary income that is driving, but it's actually the remittances which are one important component.
So now that's current account looks good. I mean, the sharp decline, but now you're going to show us what's happening with the capital account.
But that is going, because it's the POP, right? So if we have a current account improving, we are going to see a deteriorating capital account. So here we see that we see a deteriorating capital account in net inflows in the last second half of the last financial year, mainly due to decline in reserve assets, then change in reserve assets. So this reserve assets is not only rupee dollar, but it also consists of special drawing rights and our tranche position in INF. Yes, and we have observed that there is a broad-based decline in all of them. So there's a negative growth account. Then we also see the other investments. There is a significant decline in other investment. That's the yellow segment. So this is also, although it's termed as other investment, but it's a significant part of our capital flows, which includes the CD, the transactions under ECB, then ADRs, GDRs, etc., and trade credit. So there is a significant decline in the second segment. So whereas portfolio investment also declined, and foreign direct investment was volatile. So we see a sort of a decline in all of the net inflows in all of the components, except for FDI, which was a bit volatile. Sometimes it increased, sometimes it decreased.
In a sense, you're saying this reflects improvement on the current account. So this is what happened till the end of last year. Now, what's the position now, the first quarter of this year?
To look at the trade balance, we see again we are seeing a trade deficit is rising. We see that net services inflows has declined in this quarter compared to the last quarter of the last financial year. So we see a sort of indicative of current account deterioration. This one.
What is that?
Account. FDI flows, net inflows of FDI stable in this quarter, but and net portfolio investment picked up, although there is a bit of dip in July. See, but in Q1 it was picked. It picked. So there's again we see a again it's a reflection of since the capital current account balance is showing a bit widening, we see a little bit of inflow.
So overall, there's been now an improvement in reserves are going up, and that only have a reflection changes in Twitter, and also tell us about the RBI's intervention.
So we during the first half to the beginning of the last half of the last financial year, the rupee dollar exchange rate, that's the orange line, that has been depreciating. So, but it became stabilized after that. So now it is in till June step. During the same period, our real effective exchange rate was appreciating. Now we see that it has depreciated. in this quarter, in Q1 this financial year. So that is driven. So we see that that is correlated with the foreign reserve, the positive change in the foreign reserves. But again, we would like to note that RBI intervention in this quarter, in Q1 of this financial year, it's almost nil. It's not there. Even with the June, there is no. But still, we see that our dollar exchange.
Yeah. So the RBI intervention has not really made a big difference. But I don't want to put you on the spot. But do you have a view on the exchange as it is now? So there's some people have a view that it is still overvalued, the exchange. If you have a view, otherwise don't.
That will depend on the elasticity of the market.
No, but there is that view that, because we have not joined any of these regional trade organizations, the trade arrangements, which is very important for our participating supply chains. In the last 4 or 5 years, this whole business of reducing tariffs has got reversed. Tariff rates are high compared to our competitors. And on top of that, if the exchange rate also is not helpful, how will this make sense? I mean, that's one view. That was asked. But let's move on. So we've now covered the real sector and the external sector. Let's now turn to the fiscal story. Manish, would you like to take us through first of the central government budget?
Yes. So, good morning, everyone. So, let's first look at the revenue side of the central government. So, if you look at the table, you find that all tax revenues have been buoyed except excise duty. The gross tax revenue of the central government has grown annually 15% since 2019-20, which was the last pre-COVID normal year. And you compare it with the GDP growth of, it was around 10.7%. Various components of tax revenue, the income tax growth was 19%, corporation tax grew by 14%, and central GST by 13%. So you see that all of them have shown a growth higher than the growth of the nominal GDP. Going ahead in 23-24, gross tax revenue growth set at a modest 10.4%, and if you compare it with the previous year, this growth rate is very modest. The buoyancy or the direct tax growth was buoyant since 2021, largely due to improved economic activity and also because of high inflation. If you look at the monthly GST collections, they've been above or greater than 1.45 trillion per month since September 2022. That again attributed to improved economic activity, high inflation, and also because of stronger enforcement. Well, if you look at the excise duty front, in order to curb inflation, there were cuts in duties on petrol, diesel, and other food items. So that that explains the fall in excise duty. On the non-tax revenue component, we find that the growth has been very volatile. 2022-23 non-tax revenue fell by about 14% by 4% compared to 2019-20, then increased to 17% compared to 2021, and again it fell by about 22% compared to 21-22. This decline was due to lower receipts of both RBI dividends and profits of nationalized bank and other financial institutions. However, in 23-24, non-tax revenue is budgeted to grow by about 15%. So this is the medium-term picture,
and it's a good that points are so volatile from year to year, and we've gone through this 2 years big shock.
yes,
So it's appropriate that you're comparing what it looks like compared to 1920.
Yes.
And it seems on the whole quite encouraging. I mean, similar to what Kavita said in the remarks. But what has happened in the first quarter of this year?
So that's another story actually. If you look at the so if you look at the performance, it's been the Q1 performance, the April to June 23-24 performance on the revenue side. It's disappointing actually. Q1 23-24 growth in gross tax revenue was modest at 3%, and if you compare it with the last year, the growth was about 22%. So you find that the growth rate has come down in the first quarter of this fiscal, and that's quite puzzling actually. While income tax and GST registered a double-digit growth, but if you compare it with the previous year's same period growth, it is lower. Corporation tax rate growth fell by about 14%. One can attribute it to refunds only, but then you find that overall, you find that on the whole, the revenue performance in the first quarter is somewhat disappointing, but I would ask you not to read too much into it because Q1 numbers may not be reflective of the annual trend. So it has to be taken with a pinch of salt. And one has to be cautious about drawing conclusions from these numbers. These are early days, and we may have to wait for the next quarter's performance to say some.
Bring a check.
It would give you some understanding of what the annual performance would be.
So I got distracted because I have an important visit on this.
Yes, that's right. So I was saying that one should not read too much into Q1 numbers, and it's still early days. So we need to wait for another couple of months to get some clarity as what it would pan out across this fiscal. So
yeah, I'm just wondering, this is a real puzzle as we discovered, but whether it has something to do with base effect and so on. But let's not hold up the discussion. Let's move to the expenditure. What's the story?
So on the expenditure side, we see that the actual expenditure in 22-23 exceeded the budget estimate on account of extended food grain scheme. Also because of higher fertilizer subsidy due to increased global prices, and also because of higher expenditure. There has been a thrust on capital expenditure by the central government. In 22-23, capex grew by over 24%. And in contrast, the growth in revenue expenditure was just 8%. And in 23-24, the capex is budgeted to increase by 37%, while revenue expenditure is budgeted to go by mere 1%, which I think is somewhat an underestimate. But then the story is central government's thrust on capital expenditure continues in this fiscal also.
Okay, so what about the for us being a federal system, we only have, I mean, the essential is only half the story of Indian fisc. So which we've seen. Apart from the expenditure and the capital expenditure and what about the fiscal deficit of the central government before we move on to the other aspects?
So fiscal deficit target of 6.4% of GDP was met despite higher expenditure, mainly thanks to buoyant revenues. In 23-24, government had, this is in keeping with the fiscal commitment to fiscal consolidation, that government had set a target of 5.9%. Government had announced that by 25-26, it is committed to bring down the fiscal deficit below 4.5% of GDP. But the target seems somewhat challenging because in the current year, the reduction is 0.5%. In the next 2 years, the deficit has to be brought down by 0.7% every year. And given, if I may say that, given the Q1 outlook or the Q1 scenario, I would still say that it is a challenging, but and government has to make a lot of efforts to achieve that. So that
By Q1, you mean the sudden dip?
sudden dip in the revenue actions. So
Okay, so let's move to the
now
other.
let's move to the state governments, and this is so let's look at the total revenue receipts of the state government. The total revenue receipts comprises of own revenue receipt, which is again most of it is own tax revenue, and a smaller component is non-tax revenue, and the other half is the other important component is the central transfer, which comprises of devolution and central grants to states. So on average, if you see the in total revenue receipt, the share of own revenues has been around 59%. So they are the dominant source of resources or revenues of state government. And the share of central transfers is 41%. But then you can see from the left-hand side graph, those bars, red and orange, green and orange bars, there are variations across the states. And if you look at the overall, on average, all states' total revenue receipts, it grew by about 14%. But then you have, on one hand, own revenue, total revenues declining in case of Odisha by 2% to an increase of about 25% in case of Telangana. So you find that there is a huge variation, but on average, the fall was it grew by 14%, largely due to increase in own revenues. And if you look at the right-hand graph, you find that on average, own tax revenue grew at an even higher rate of about 19%. However, see that in Himachal, Andhra Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh, the growth has been moderate, less than 10%, but then you find there are huge variations across states in this in the tax revenue growth. And in 23-24, all states have budgeted the tax revenue to grow by about 20%. So growth of 19% in 23 compared to 21-22. Going forward, they have budgeted to for about a 20% growth in taxes. So that's the story of the revenue sides of these states.
What about now the transfers receiving from?
Okay, so this figure shows changes in central transfers 2023 over 21. So compared to 21-22, we see the increase in central transfers have been modest at about 7%. But if you look at the dotted line, which shows the overall transfer, you see that there was a dip in central transfers in 4 states: Kerala, Rajasthan, Himachal, and Andhra Pradesh. Now, if you look at the different components of transfers, the devolution, the increase has been modest at about 7.6% compared to 21-22. But there was a decline in grants in 11 states. So you can see the greenish bars below the x-axis. Those are the states where you see a decline in grants, and this could be because of the compensation period ended by end June 2022, and GST compensation to states was booked as grants. So this could be one of the reasons for a decline in grants in so many states. If you look at the all states combined budgets, they indicate an 8% decline in grants. And in fact, 18 out of 20 states budgets have assumed grants to decline in 23-24. So while total revenue growth was good, but the increase in transfers have been modest. That's the revenue side of the.
Before we continue on this composition of the transfer between, what you've just been saying is about the various cuts in grants and so on. reduction. Uh, Traditionally, devolution is a larger component of transfers and grants were smaller. What is the picture now between devolution and grants?
You're right, sir. Normally, you'd see that the share of devolution to be higher than the grants. Devolution is untied transfer. Grants are conditional linked to various conditionalities. In 22-23, we find that out of the total transfers, 53% was accounted by grants. The share of devolution was 47%. And in fact, if you look at this graph, you find devolution was in out of the 20 out of 20 states, 28 states, devolution was larger than grant in just 8 states. And I think it's a recent phenomena that grants exceeding devolution in most states. But if you look if you look at the long-term picture, 2021 or 2021 was the year when you actually see in aggregate the share of grants to be higher than devolution. But then grants are almost similar in magnitude to the grants to devolution. But then this is a recent phenomenon. But if you look at even longer time period, it's the devolution which dominated the transfers.
In the past, but we have to be careful from a federalism point of view on whether this is a turning point.
Yes.
Because a large component of grants are they're discretionary grants.
Discretionary.
Which the central government can decide. Not, I don't mean the finance commission transfer.
No.
Rest. So this is something important to watch. Because it reflects the proportion between discretionary and non-discretionary transfers from the center to the state.
A large part of it to CSS also.
That's right. It was a complete discretionary.
Yes.
Right. Okay. So let's leave the receipt side. Let's move on to the expenditure side.
So let's look at the expenditure side. This the graph shows the change in state expenditure. The black line is the total expenditure. The green is red, and the capital expenditure. So if you see the increase, we see an increase in total expenditure, and it is driven by increases in both revenue and capital expenditure. That dotted rectangle, which is the growth of all states' revenue and capital expenditure. But then you can see there are variations across states. States' average capex growth moderate at 12.8%. In fact, we see a decline in capex in several states. In fact, 7 states show a decline. So the blue line is below on the left-hand side, the blue line is below the x-axis for 7 states. In 23-24, all states budgeted capex increase is about 18%, but 9 states have budgeted for a reduction in capital expenditure. Also, there has been a major central support for states capex through 50-year interest capex loan of about 1 trillion in 22-23, of which 95,000 crore was approved till March 22-23, but 81,000 crores were actually transferred, and out of it, 33,000 crore was transferred in the last month, in the month of March. So most of a large component of the money that was capex that was transferred in the month of March. Going ahead in 23-24, we see a continued central support for state capex. Not only the quantum was also increased to about 1.3 trillion from 1 trillion in the previous year. And as per the latest information available till March, 25,000 crores have been approved. And this is indicative of a step up in states capex in Q1. So the money that was released in the last month plus the money that we received so would be reflected in the Q1 performance of states capital expenditure. So
probably the significant part of it is from this facility.
From this facility, yes.
Which are actually loans.
50 years.
It is zero interest 50 years, but it is still a loan. I'm reading that. So let's see now what's happening to the fiscal deficit, the revenue deficit of the states.
So on the deficit front, we see all states combined fiscal deficit as a percentage of GDP in 22-23 is lower compared to recent years in 2019-20. So the fiscal deficit, and this is also true for the revenue deficit. The fiscal deficit in 2023 was 2.75%, and the revenue deficit was 0.24%. State fiscal consolidation is largely driven by joint own tax revenues, and in 2023-24, all state combined fiscal deficit is budgeted to be around 3.2% of GSDP. And if you translate into as a percent of GDP, it's around 3.0506%. So largely in sync with the 15th FC fiscal consolidation path.
But close to that already.
So,
And if you bring together the deficit performance of the states and that of the center, what's the picture there?
so if you look at the fiscal position of these general government states plus center, so combined fiscal deficit is budgeted at around 9% in 23-24. The revenue deficit at 3.1% of GDP. States fiscal consolidation largely driven by joint tax revenue, as I said, and states combined fiscal consolidation path is consistent with 15th FC recommendations. However, central government needs to make a stronger effort towards fiscal consolidation. So whatever government is committed to, in order to achieve that, it has to make an extra effort in terms of realizing that goal and also adhering to the 15th FC or even its own target of achieving fiscal deficit of less than 4.5% GDP in 25-26.
Even in terms of budgets, this is challenging because they're reducing it by 0.5% every year.
Yes.
But this means for the remaining 2 years, they would have to be reduced by 7%. And this is not taking into account yet the sharp dip in revenues that we've seen in first quarter. If that persists, then it becomes even more challenging. Okay, so we have a fairly comprehensive picture now of the fiscal side of the story. Mixed picture, some good news, some bad news, and so on. Let's now move on to financial markets and monetary policy. Radhika, what's been the most recent developments on monetary policy side?
We start with the RBI's monetary policy statement. So what we've seen is that last financial year, RBI raised the policy repo rate by 250 basis points. So in consonance with what has been happening in other countries, we have seen monetary policy tightening by RBI. Since from May 2022 till February 23, we saw RBI raising rates by 250 basis points. And in this financial year, we have already had 3 policy meetings, April, June, and August. And in all the 3 policy meetings, RBI has chosen to keep the policy rate unchanged and also to keep the stance unchanged at withdrawal of accommodation. That means that there is surplus liquidity and the RBI would like to withdraw liquidity from the banking system. What this is showing is also getting reflected in the short-term interest rates. So the black line shows the repo rate, which shows that we had a period where monetary policy easing happened, and then we had a period of status quo on rates, and then from May 2022, we saw a sharp surge in policy rates. And that is also being followed by the trajectory of other short-term rates. So if you look at the 91-day treasury bill, we look at the call money rate, all these short-term rates are mirroring the trend in the policy rate. So that has been the main story on the short-term policy rate. And RBI has been conducting regular liquidity operations through variable repo and reverse repo auctions to to manage the liquidity, because there have been periods where liquidity turns deficit, there have been periods where liquidity turns surplus. So RBI is managing that through variable repo options, which tends to infuse liquidity into the system, and variable reverse repo options, which tend to withdraw liquidity. So that's the story on the short-term rates.
Short-term rates. What about what's been happening to yields and so on government bonds?
Yes, so here we are seeing a very interesting picture. If we look at a longer picture, like say from Jan 2022, normally what we see is an upward sloping yield curve, right? We see that if we have to park funds for a longer duration, we will need a higher interest rate, and for shorter duration, we will need a lower interest rate. So normally, 10-year bond yield is more than a 1-year bond yield. So that is what normally happens. But if we see over a period from Jan 2022 till as recent as 3rd of August, what we have seen is convergence in bond yields. That means that the short-term yields have risen much faster and long-term yields have been broadly steady and have actually moderated. So the reason for this is that there are different factors affecting the trajectory of short-term and long-term bond yields. The short-term bond yields are more influenced by monetary policy tightening. They are more sensitive to the liquidity conditions in the banking system. So that has been volatile, and RBI has been following an aggressive monetary policy tightening. And therefore, we have seen that the short-term rates have risen quite steeply, whereas long-term rates, the 10-year bond yield particularly, is more influenced by what's happening in the US, in other advanced countries. And there we have seen that the US 10-year bond has also not risen to that extent. So even if in the US and all, we are seeing a kind of a flattening or inversion of yield curve. That means that the long-term yields are lower than the short-term yields. So that kind of picture is also getting reflected in our sovereign bond market, that long-term yields have remained stable and have actually moderated, reflecting the easing of monetary policy. So that is what is seen in the 10-year bond yields. It's only recently, like if we just focus on the last few weeks events, that we have seen that the 10-year bond yield have started to inch up, and that is due to, we saw 3 banks raising their policy rate. The US three central banks raising their policy rate. The US Fed, the Bank of England, and the European Central Bank. They all increased their policy rate by 25 basis points. There is a resurgence of inflationary pressures. There's also the Fitch downgrade of the US sovereign debt, which led to some volatility in the bond yield in the other countries. The short-term yields inched up, the long-term yield, the US bond yields inched up, and that also got mirrored in our yields. But in general, if we zoom out and look out for a longer period of time, we see that the 10-year bond yields have largely remained range-bound, and it's the short-term yields that have shown the fluctuations.
Okay. So this flattening of the yield curve on sovereign bonds, how is that affecting the corporate bond market, private sector?
Yes. So we see that the sovereign bond yield serves as a benchmark for corporate bond yield. So we see a similar kind of trajectory in even the corporate bond market. So corporate bond market yields have also followed the kind of trajectory that we saw in the government bond yields. That means that there was a period in, say, Jan 2022 when the 10-year bond yields were much higher than the short-term yields. But since then, we have seen a sharp upsurge in the shorter-term bond yields. And the long-term bond yields, the long-term corporate bond yields, the 10-year corporate bond yields have remained steady and have actually moderated. This is also reflective of a kind of demand-supply situation scenario in the bond market, which is that there is a greater demand for issuances of short-term bonds. That means the companies or the issuers of bonds are more interested in issuing short-term or medium-term bonds. So there is a greater supply of short-term bonds in the market, which tends to inch up, which tends to put an upward pressure on the bond yield. Whereas from the demand side, there is greater demand for 10-year bond yield. Because who are the major investors in the corporate bond market? They are the institutional investors, they are the pension funds, they are the insurance funds, and they are more interested in locking their funds in long-term yield. So while there is a greater demand for long-term yields, there is a greater supply of short-term bond yields, and that is also causing this interesting mix of trajectory changes in the bond yields, whereby the short-term yields have risen because there is more supply and less demand for short-term bond yields that have caused an upsurge in the yields. And cumulatively, we are again seeing convergence of yields over a longer duration.
That's really quite interesting, something worth watching as we move forward. But in its in yesterday's monetary policy statement that the governor made, and earlier, and also in your discussion, there's quite a lot of discussion about liquidity management. Now, this is not something that really is understood by people. So just walk us through this and what is really liquidity, what is liquidity management?
RBI, one objective is to manage inflation, but the other objective is also to manage liquidity in the banking system. And by liquidity, what do we mean? We mean the two things. Firstly, there is a borrowing by commercial banks from the RBI. So commercial banks, if they are facing a shortage of funds due to regulatory requirements or due to increase in demand for credit, if they are facing demand for funds, they can borrow from RBI under the repo window, MSF and SDA. So that is an action which will lead to infusion of liquidity in the market. Whereas if banks are already having surplus funds, because maybe there is less demand for credit, they are already having, there is more deposits but less demand for credit, then they have a window to place their excess surplus reserves with the RBI, and then the RBI offers them interest rates. So that is called the reverse repo transaction. So repo transaction is where RBI is lending to commercial banks, and RBI is charging an interest rate, which is the repo rate. Whereas reverse repo is when banks are placing their surplus funds with the RBI and RBI is offering them interest rate. So the combination of these two actions will determine the liquidity situation in the market. That means if there is excess surplus funds with the banks, that means that there is liquidity, there is excess liquidity. So then what RBI will do is RBI will do more of variable reverse repo auctions to absorb liquidity. Whereas if RBI feels that there is a liquidity deficit, it will infuse liquidity through repo transaction. So that is what is generally happening on regular intervals. Normally what happens around the end of the June quarter, we see that there's tax outflow and the liquidity sharply goes down. Then the RBI infuses liquidity through repo auction. So the combination of these two events determine the liquidity in the market. So if the banking system is a net borrower, that means that their system liquidity is in deficit. Whereas if the banking system is a net lender, that means banking system is placing reserves with the RBI, that means that there is liquidity surplus in the market. And notation wise, that means that the system demand for funds is negative because they're already holding so much fund. So that means that in notation terms, it is expressed as a negative number.
Yeah. But this should be reflected in also in the short term.
Yes, right? Yes. So normally it should get reflected in the short-term call rates because if there is liquidity deficit, then the call rate should rise. What is call rate? Call rate is the rate at which banks borrow amongst themselves on an overnight basis, short-term basis. So if there is liquidity deficit, then the call rate should increase. But if we just bring these two pictures together, that is, we bring the liquidity picture and the call money rate, what we have been seeing is that liquidity has been in surplus, but even then the call rates have risen. So you can see from April 2022, call rates have risen. And in recent times, there have been occasions when the call rate had even risen more than the upper end of the LAF corridor. So what is LAF? It's the liquidity adjustment facility. In between is the policy repo rate, and then 25 basis points above that is the marginal standing facility. Below that is the SDA. So we have seen call rates even in some instances spiking even above the marginal standing facility. And normally the intent of the Reserve Bank of India through its liquidity operation is to ensure that the call money rate is closer to the policy repo rate. Whenever there is a big gap between call rate and the repo rate, it will either infuse liquidity or withdraw liquidity. So this is very interesting phenomenon.
It's an anomaly, no?
This is an anomaly. This is kind of a
Yes.
because on the one side we are seeing liquidity is in surplus, but even then we are seeing that the call rates have, even till the recent data, we are seeing that the call rates have been hovering above the policy repo rate, which is the red line. And how do we decipher this puzzle? One possible reason could be that there are some banks that are holding surplus liquidity, but there are other banks that are having deficit. They are scrambling for funds, and that is getting reflected in the higher call rates.
So this anomaly, maybe that statement is a good point to segue to what's happening to bank credit flows.
Yes.
Tell us that story.
Yes, so despite increase in the policy repo rate, we have seen that the non-core bank credit has been growing at a robust pace. For the last financial year, non-core bank credit grew by more than 15%, which is a very strong growth despite the monetary policy tightening. And even in this financial year, now we have data for the first quarter. So high credit growth continues, and we've seen a 16% growth in the non-core bank credit. Even after we've seen HDFC merger that has resulted in even higher credit growth in the recent few weeks. So that is on the headline credit growth. But what is also interesting is to look at the composition, that what are the components that have been driving this non-core bank credit growth. And there we see that there are two main components, the personal loans and loans to services that have shown a brisk growth. Both of them have been rising above 20%, registering above 20% growth. Whereas if we see credit to industry, it has been largely muted. And if we particularly look at credit to large industry as a share of GDP, we have seen a considerable decline. So the ratio has declined from 18.2%, which is the credit to large industries, and the share of the GDP. It has declined from 18% in 2014 to 9%. So that is the story, that overall the non-core bank credit has been growing at a robust pace. But if we look at the composition, it's the two main components that have driven the credit growth are personal loans and services, that is loans to households and services. Within services, it's the NBFCs are borrowing from banks. Their reliance on banks have increased in the last few years. We have seen from 2019 onwards, we have seen the reliance of NBFCs on bank credit has increased. So that is getting reflected in higher credit to services.
So, we're basically seeing a very robust credit growth period as you have described. And often what happens, and we saw this during the last long period of conflict, but in India, but also in other countries, is that there's less sort of prudential, oversight on lending and so on, and the non-performing assets tend to go up. So what is happening to the NPAs now with this robust credit growth that we see?
Yes, so encouragingly, even though credit growth has been robust and we saw a period of regulatory forbearance during the COVID period, even then we have seen that there has been a declining trajectory of non-performing assets, which means that the bank's balance sheets have improved. The worst period we saw was the first quarter of 2018, April to June 2018, when the NPAs of the banking system as a whole rose above 10%, and mainly driven by NPAs of public sector banks that had risen to almost 15%. But now we see there has been a consistent decline in the NPAs thanks to more focused regulatory intervention So we have seen that NPAs have declined and mainly driven by decline in NPAs of public sector banks. So, and as per the recent data, the NPAs of the aggregate banking system is now 3.9%, and for public sector banks it is 5%. So, similar to what we saw in the bond yield, here also we see a convergence story where the NPAs have declined sharply, and now we are seeing there was a time when there was a big difference between the NPAs of public sector and private sector banks, and now we see that that differential has narrowed substantially.
This is the real good news.
Yes.
Kavita is now fortunately back in the room. I started asking us, what's the good story? And here it is, I think, it's the major good story. This is really a long-standing, very, very healthy time. And others have noted, the economists write up about this. Let me now ask you a little bit about what's been happening on foreign capital flows. Yeah, before we finish with the finances.
Yes, so here also, if we just look at this calendar year, what's happening in this calendar year, leaving aside the first 2 months, in the first 2 months we saw the stock market was in red. That means the returns were negative if we compare the closing returns, the index returns of the previous month with the present month. But since then, we have seen that markets have recovered, and that is also getting reflected in the net investment by foreign portfolio investors. Barring the first 2 months, January and March, we have seen that foreign portfolio investors have been net buyers in the equity market. We saw the peak of investments in June 2023. The momentum continued in July as well, but in July, as we discussed earlier also, the last week of July imparted some volatility both to the market as well as to the FPI investments because of monetary policy tightening, because of rebound in oil prices. Now we are seeing a sharp rebound in oil prices due to cuts in production announced by OPEC countries, Saudi Arabia, Russia, and so that's getting reflected in the market sentiment. So even though July overall we saw net buying by FPI, it was lower than what we saw in June, mainly because of the recent events that we've seen in the geopolitical space, and which is also reflected in the markets. Markets also peaked in June, and in July also the returns were positive, but it was more modest as compared to the June numbers. So it's mainly driven by, we are seeing some volatility in the recent weeks, mainly due to the starting triggered by the Fitch downgrade of the US sovereign debt. But that impact was actually short-lived. But the reason why Fitch downgraded was the high debts and deficits of the US economy, which still continue. And US has actually increased their borrowing targets for the quarter, which is getting reflected in higher yields and lower market returns. So that is what we are seeing in the markets.
Thanks very much. Our panelists have now been, talking for over an hour, giving us a very comprehensive and at the same time very detailed account of how the economy is performing. We should soon go on to the Q&A session. I'm sure many of you have lots of questions. But before that, because it's such a long and detailed program, let me just very quickly give you the key takeaways that we have seen from the presentation. So first, on the real economy, growth, inflation, balance payment, and so on, we have seen a slowdown, a very significant slowdown in H2 of the last fiscal year because of the fading base effect that we've done talked about, and also reduced growth of consumption and investment demand. That will be reflected mainly in the slowdown in services. For the current year, forecast is that the growth may slow down even further from 7.2% last year to about 6% this year, which is in the same ballpark as a lot of other forecasts, slightly on the lower side. The industrial growth has been relatively buoyant in the first quarter of this year, based on leading indicators, especially construction and consumer durables. But agricultural growth has been muted, a lot of volatility in weather conditions, and also services growth continues to be sluggish. Switching to the inflation story, the inflation rate is now within the headline rate, within the RBI upper end of its tolerance band at 6%. And the decline has been fairly broad-based, covering food, energy, as well as core inflation. Uh, as we know, there's been this little uptick, which is fortunately causing concern in policymakers very early in the day before we hit really high rates of inflation. That's a good thing. And our forecast that he gave us is 5.1% for the year as a whole. On the external sector, current account deficit has fortunately contracted to 0.2% of GDP in H2. That's because the trade deficit in goods declined while that on the surplus on services increased. But unfortunately, in the first quarter of this year, our indicators show that it has started widening again because the goods deficit has increased while the surplus on the services side has tended to shrink. Capital flows declined from about nearly $50 billion in the first half to only less than $20 billion in the second half. And this was mainly due to decline in reserve assets and foreign portfolio investments, while FDI remained kind of volatile. In the first quarter of this year, FDI first recovered and has then stabilized, whereas foreign portfolio investment has peaked. This is again the qualification of the last couple of weeks because of what's happening in Fitch and so on. So our overall, the current account balance has been, the capital balance has been good, and our reserves have been going up. As a result, the both the nominal as well as real effective exchange rate have stopped depreciating. Now, whether this is a good thing or a bad thing, as I mentioned earlier, there are different views on this. There's one view that given that India does not participate in any of the trade agreements, that we have reversed the lowering of tariff rates and so on that started in 91 during the last few years, that even if the exchange rate policy is not going to help push exports, then what will? So that's the picture on the real sector and external sector. Coming to fiscal performance, I think the key feature of fiscal performance that Manish told us is very buoyant tax revenues during since 1920, except of course for the shock period that we know about. Central tax excise duties have been exception to that story. The other and probably more important thing is this continuing massive central government thrust on capital expenditure, which is also being picked up now in the states, and that along with ongoing fiscal control. I think that's the big picture. The central government revenues have been buoyant, as I said, in particular GST. Now we're every month collecting more than 1.5 trillion. All the initial bugs have been sorted out in the last 2 or 3 years. There's been a sharp decline in revenue tax revenue growth, in particular in the first quarter of this year. And this is very worrying. It's a puzzle. It's not clear why it is happening. And whether this will continue for the rest of the year or not remains to be seen. Meanwhile, central capital expenditure, which rose by 24% last year, is now budgeted to rise by a massive 37% this year. And this is already being seen on the ground and surely is one of the major drivers of growth. But revenue expenditure is scheduled to grow by only 1%. And this reflects, I think, the government's commitment to pursuing fiscal consolidation, central government's commitment to fiscal consolidation, along with the thrust on capital expenditure. Particularly important in this is, as And 50-year zero interest loan of 1 trillion has been raised even further to 1.3 trillion in this budget. State governments, very large variations across different states, but to take the model picture, on average, very robust home tax revenue growth, uh, revenue growth in general, but tax revenue growth in particular, and it's about 19% growing at the rate, and compared to transfers from the central government, which is the other part of the revenue receipts, is growing at only 7%. Earlier, devolution used to be the major component of transfers, but in the recent period, this has become grants, large part of which are discretionary, become the major component. This is worth watching what happens going forward from the fiscal federalism angle. Central's capital capex performance has been modest despite the central support. However, as I think Manish mentioned, in the first quarter, this may be changing, and the states also may be pushing on the capital expenditure front. States' fiscal deficit performance has been very impressive. They're actually down to 2.8% of GSDP in 22-23, set at slightly higher than 3.2% if you add up all the states for 23-24. But on the whole, they seem to be on track to meet that target, which has been adopted. And the 15th Finance Commission also recommended for getting it down to less than 3% by 25-26. Slightly different picture for the center. It is also consolidating, despite maintaining this strong push to capital expenditure. But particularly given the slowdown in tax receipts the first of this year, this seems to be a little challenging to reach a goal of 4.5% deficit by 25-26, and it will require a stronger effort. Now, quickly getting into the monetary policy and financial sector, repo rate raised by 250 basis points, as Radhika said, between May 22 and February 23. Other monetary policy tightening measures have gone along with that. In response, all money rates have risen and are closely tracking, sometimes even exceeding the policy rate, despite the surplus liquidity. And she explained why they might be seeing this kind of in financial markets. There has been a flattening of the yield curve, both short-term and long-term government bond yields have converged, both for sovereign bonds as well as for the private sector corporate bonds and so on. And this, again, she explained, has to do with the different preferences of those who are for lending money and those who are borrowing money in terms of their maturity preferences. Credit growth rates have been very buoyant despite rising interest rates. And fortunately, this has happened along with a reduction in the non-performing assets. Sometimes things when there's a lot of credit flowing easily, the NPAs tend to go up. This hasn't happened. In fact, NPAs have been coming down quite sharply. And most interestingly, and fortunately, it is really the public sector banks NPAs that have come down a lot and now converging. Capital markets have been buoyant, mainly thanks to the large buying by portfolio investors. With the increase in rates in their own country, the recent resurgence in food prices, and of course the fixed downgrade of US sovereign debt, we don't know whether this story is going to change or not for the rest of the year. So let me stop there, and that sums up the panel discussion. We can now go on to the more interesting part of this morning, which is the Q&A session. So those of you who have questions to ask, please raise your hand, announce your give us a name, and mention a question. I just want to also add that, as I mentioned at the outset, those of you who are attending online, If you have questions, I hope you put it on the chat box, and after we go around the room, I will turn to the chat box question. And this includes the auxiliary room. Some of you, if you spill over, this room is full. You may be attending this from the adjoining room. If you have questions, please put it on the chat box. Thank you. So, any questions? Let me start with the gentleman right here. Please. Yes, please start.
Thank you, Rodani, Radhika. I think that was an incredibly concise and very crisp and very clinical presentation. And I think when I walked in and I saw there were no seats, I said, this is a really successful venture. And thank you, you've just put this whole thing together really well. There are three things that I'd like to comment on. First, I think what has been amazing is the way our economy has been handled. Right in the middle of the COVID period, I'm sure none of us expected that the government would be able to have such a relatively smooth path. And I think that, we must congratulate not just the government, but also the macroeconomists, including yourselves, who have been part of the whole debate, discussion, and the whole process of discourse that feeds into this. I like every single element, and I really like the clinical nature of this presentation. But I'd like to just ask two questions, which is, why don't you look into the corporate sector performance a bit more better? Because that seemed to be the corollary to many of the things that have been spoken here. And the second is actually more of a request than a question. It would be great if you can get follow employment numbers, especially at least with the PLFS. I understand that they are a bit dated and so on, but perhaps with your close connect with the government, you might be able to do that. I think it would be really nice to tie in employment with all of this. So I'd just like you to answer just one question. Any feedback on the private sector, corporate sector performance, especially related to investment, and also some element related to FDI. From what I've been told, and I haven't followed these numbers, is that the bulk of FDI, net FDI, etc., is essentially coming in as reinvestment profit. Not really.
Thanks, well. Let's go on collect questions and we have it. Yeah, please, Black shirt. Please announce your name. Yeah.
My name is Samrat Sharma, and I'm the data analysis unit of India Today. And my question has somehow come in line with your question. We found out that corporation tax fell by 40%. So this pushed me to think about the unemployment figures. I understand that it's not very explicit like other macroeconomic parameters, but I would like to ask, what's the closest thing to gauge it? If I want to understand Q1 23-24 figures of unemployment, what's the closest thing and how I can do it? And number two, since gig economy is a very large part of our economy, so is there any way we can gauge gig economy at least 20 to 25% of what we know about the economy?
Sorry, which economy?
Informal.
Okay, great. Excellent. Yes.
So one question is, what has happened to market borrowing as far as states are concerned? Especially for states where capex has taken time. Okay, states that actually market borrowing. Second question is to on the macro side. What has happened to the human wage growth? Because if you're talking about a broad-based recovery, is that picking up because this K-shaped recovery that we talk about is that getting pitched now?
Yeah. I just leave the line. Sorry, oops.
So the question, first of all, I wanted to congratulate you, Rani and team for really superb rendition. I'm more used to doing this in December, when we, yeah, so it's video. But I think early on in the year, this is very useful. Congratulations. Both the substance as well as the presentation. I had a question, a number of different questions, but a question on trade policy and the exchange rate. You did a little bit refer to whether or not India is missing out on opportunities, though they may be in a world that is in turmoil in many ways, the China tension and the war in Ukraine. But with that, having an exchange rate that's hovering effectively around, and the real exchange rate hovering around where it is, rather than what others have suggested, maybe we should be close to 100. And then we are missing out on opportunities on the one side, and on the other side, trying to make that up through a very aggressive industrial policy and trade policy that is going quite in the opposite direction from where history has taught us economies can benefit. So I think that's a very large question in front of us, and I think there are major ramifications for the future.
Thanks, Shekhar. If there are no other questions, I'll first request the. Okay, there's one more, and after that we'll go to the one and answer, then go to the question.
Sorry. So, my name is Sukanya. I work here at the Macroeconomic. Excellent presentations, and I have lots of questions, but still a couple maybe. So, one thing which I was curious about, and we spoke about it, Radhika spoke about it in the last presentation, is that in this overall buoyant credit growth story, what is happening to the MSME credit? I think that came out very clearly last time, not so much. I am also curious about this 250 basis point increase in the repo rate and the implication of the yields, and therefore also what is happening for the government debt servicing and the debt story, because that I thought was the fiscal story. So also if you could comment on this inverted yield and the expectations, because this does point to certain. Manish, I was curious to know about whether this 87,000 crore capex loan to the states, it probably appears in the budget as grants and therefore revenue expenditure, but is it the money which is expect, and can we expect therefore a multiplier effect of that expenditure, or is this money being transferred? Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Just sorry, I got. So the last question was what? I didn't get it.
Whether that 87,000 crore states.
Yes. Yes.
As capex.
Yes.
Is it money utilized or is it money transfer?
Oh, okay.
I have my okay. Before that, India today. Actually, private consumption expenditure is going down. Around reaching 60.8%. Last 2 years lowest level. So how do people say macro in this state? Even rate of investment, macro term. I'm talking about the gross capital formation. So that's also is very lowest level. I think 4 or 6 years lowest level. And what is the means of this decline?
What is the
Mean of this decline trend?
meaning?
Yeah.
Implication. Yeah. So
So this is the question about the good part about the NPA. What does history show us, Radhika, on whether NPAs are a lagged outcome of easy credit? And are we looking at the news a bit prematurely in terms of what might happen, say, a year from now?
So let's, a lot of very good questions. We'll come to those of you who sent questions in the chat box after doing the round of answers to questions around the room here. So Lavish's first question, would we have a closer look at corporate performance? It's true, we have not covered that at all really. So I would say either Rudrani or Radhika, you all have any comments on that? And later Rudrani can also pick up his question with others also raised about the employment picture based on PLMS survey.
We have not really looked at the performance in this analysis, but actually, I have tracked the investment from capex database of CMI. So it's been showing that in this quarter, there's a unprecedented growth in the completion of projects, but not the. So there's a might get a robust industrial growth to its completion projects.
So on the corporate sector, so it's not covered, but we do every monitor.
Speak in the mic so others can also hear.
On the corporate sector, we have been monitoring the trends of what is happening to the sales growth and profitability. And currently, if we just look at the first quarter, the April quarter, which will have some implications for the GDP numbers also. So what we are seeing is and it's early birds, we have results only for a select group of companies. We are seeing that sales has slightly moderated. The sales growth has moderated, but on the other side, profits have been doing well. The profit after tax have been quite robust, and that is also kind of a conflict between the fact that the corporation tax collections have gone down, but the corporate profits have risen up. But that could also be due to lopsided growth. It may well be contributed by a few specific companies of a few sectors. So there is a need to delve deeper into the composition. But what is clear is that the sales growth has been moderating. The sales output has been moderating. The interest expenses have been picking up. So what we are talking in terms of the monetary policy transmission lag impact is getting captured in the interest expenses of companies. But as of now, the profitability of companies have been quite okay. They have been growing at double-digit growth.
But in real terms,
yeah,
real terms.
Yes, real terms. It's 20% growth in profits. Yeah.
So there's the other part, this question about the employment scenario. That was also your question. So
I really don't have this.
I think the picture is that we have from the PLFS, and CMI gives us very frequent high frequency change, and it's been bobbing up and down around broadly. I remember correctly something around 8% or so, but these numbers on overall unemployment, and it relates to the other part of your question, I think, about the informal economy. We don't know what is being picked up. Since you're saying this, then let me just make a remark over here. From my field visits, I find that there's a huge amount of temporary migration and circulatory migration. People who don't have work or don't want to do the kind of work and they're not very happy with what Manrega offers and so on, in rural areas across most of the backward regions. are going to places like Chennai, Kerala, Hyderabad, near the Gurgaon and so on. Now, these people are not picked up in the unemployment, they're not being recorded. It was in the origin or in the destination. The destination they're living in there where they're doing the work makes me mainly construction workers. So I think all our employment statistics, including the PLFS, are just missing a big part of the story. And it may be a story of more dynamism than we are seeing. But this is very speculative. Since you asked the question, and I'm just saying this, we are not seeing enough on the informal sector, but I think now they're going to do these surveys annually on the informal sector enterprises. So let's see what comes up. Let's move on. Shekhar's. No. There's a question on the real wage movement. Yeah. And on market borrowing by states. We have those two questions. So first on real wages and market borrowing.
During the beginning of the year 21-22, we started seeing a level of demand, and that was quite a bit by the rural demand. Agricultural demand, agricultural wage was rising. Rural CPI was steady, so there is rural wage was rising. So, and as we find that the consumer non-durables, which are like the very clothes, shoes, this thing. So these are lower end products. See that for that products are being picked up. So these two are actually getting an impact. So it's happening, but with the monetary tightening, and one difference in this rising demand in 21 is that with the COVID period, is that during COVID period there is a demand on personal vehicles, by personal vehicles and so if you look at the price that helps to those items is high, but now later from when we saw that there is a broad-based for prices rising. So these always are indicating that people's demand for a broad-based thing were picking up, but again with the monetary tightening, we might expect.
Thank you. Now, Shekhar's questions, and he did actually what I was also trying to raise earlier, that is India missing an opportunity on trade policy in general, especially referred also to exchange rates, our exchange rate management, but overall trade policy, tariff policies, what we're doing or not doing in terms of driving these regional trade agreements. Both of you.
There has been, as I pointed out, a reversal of liberalization policy, a series of raising of tariffs, and that is one of the reasons advocated in the security concern. But we know that majorly it is for protection and imparting protection to domestic manufacturing sector. But whether this is the right way or not, we need to see, because we've seen even on the agricultural front banning of exports of rice. So all these things are in the medium to long run do not bode well for either the trade policy, because then going forward, countries would find alternate trading partners. So this is something which is an area of concern. Also, in some of the other sectors, we have not been able to capture the advantage of China's slowdown, particularly Vietnam, Bangladesh. These countries have picked up in terms of their textile exports, but we have not been able to do. So this is one area which will have an implication for exchange rate also. So whether exchange rate is actually capturing the market developments is a question mark. One is it is overvalued, and the other is also that RBI has been Okay, for the 22-23 did not, but we are seeing some active intervention. There are intervention in the forwards market as well. So we are seeing a very narrow range of exchange rate movement. So I think all these policies are consistent. On the one side, there is protectionism. On the one side, there is very narrow movement of exchange rate, which might not reflect the market fundamentals.
Just to add one point here, that India is a very big importer of intermediate. So in your tariff rate hike, that is going to affect your production. It's not going to be helpful in terms of.
Okay. So, is it your own view on this? Sukanya's questions. What is happening? First of all, two questions. First of all, what is happening to MSME credit?
Yeah, so overall, industry credit as a whole has not seen a very sharp growth. It's mainly the personal loans and services, but within industry, it's mainly driven by MSME, micro, small, and medium enterprises. But there also now what we are seeing over the last 2 months, there has been a slowdown. So in terms of year-on-year change, micro, small, and medium enterprises, the credit point to MSMEs has seen a slowdown over the last 2 months. We need to see whether this trend is sustained. But yes, that is one point that needs to, within the composition of bank credit. While the large industries have not picked up, it's only recently we are seeing very sharp, very small uptick in the large industry credit. But in MSMEs in general, we saw a peak of growth in the last meeting we had discussed. That's mainly driven by MSMEs. But in MSMEs now we have started seeing a slowdown in credit.
Can you share the composition of MSME, the whole industry? Whole industrial credit.
Yeah. It's not too big. Overall, I think it's less than 5%. It's been hovering around. It's slightly increased. It's slightly touched 6% from 4.5%. So that is also one thing. But from COVID time, we have seen a big increase in absolute levels of credit going to.
Otherwise, 5 to 6%.
Yes.
Yes, formal bank credit.
Yeah, just one thing, that's exactly what it is. One of the sources of major credit growth are the non-bank financial institutions.
Yes.
And if these small chaps may worry from them, so we don't know what actually is the picture. Credit directly is one thing, but then you look at NBFCs, where they are lending the money.
Even NBFCs have financed by banks.
Yeah. That is on the receipt side.
But compared to the larger industries
Yes.
and MSME, what is the trend for this particular two set of industry?
Yeah.
So what's the composition over the last 10 years?
So
we maintain 5 to 6%.
Yeah, I was just saying that to get the full picture, you need a picture of not only bank credit flows, but bank credit flows plus the on lending of the NBFCs, money they borrow from banks. Then you get a full picture of,
So within MSME, there is a lot of variation also. So micro, medium, and small enterprises. So during the COVID period, medium got a lot of. They took those credit easing policies that was announced by the government. So they took a lot of benefit from there. But the micro was not. So medium and small. So even within the there is a lot of variation.
Because the share is small, it doesn't also get reflected too much on the entities. Even if you look at the financial stability report, though there are some pockets of stress in the banking sector credit, but it's very small because the share of MSMEs of the overall bank credit is very small. So even if there is a default, it doesn't get reflected in the banking sector NPA as too much. But as some
contribution of the employment and total output in the economy. This MSME,
it's around 25 to 26%.
25% their contribution.
Yes. But in terms of exports, it's much higher, around 38 to 40%. But as Sir said, if you want to look at MSME's credit, it's not just the bank credit. We have to look at NBFCs, fintech, and other sources to get the full picture.
Tanya's other question has to do with government, what's the picture on government debt and how it relates to.
So these capex, I don't think in deposit as grants, they will figure it in the central loans to states. That is one thing. Second is, if you look at the guidelines of the of this 50 years loan, so states government 80. So in the first year, 80,000 was to be given through the SC inter-se formula, and 20% was into smaller bits or you have linked to various other things. But then, in order to get the money, you have to provide a detailed plan about where the which project you are using, and that has to be approved by the central government. So whatever is transferred, so you have to be the projects have to be ready for financing, and a lot of it was for completion of some of the ongoing work. So I presume that what was released would be utilized, because it's only once the government is sure that this money is to be utilized, or you are in a position to immediately utilize it. The money transferred would be largely utilized, I would say, and also interaction with some of the people in the finance department of some of the states. They said that we have prepared a list of projects where we need fund and money, and then we are utilizing it. So it's not that it's just transferred and sitting there somewhere, it's being utilized. So I presume so transferred would, by and large, more than 90% of it would be utilized in that financial year.
Okay, but there was also reference to inversion of bond rates.
So
Yes,
we had some instances of inverted yield curve, sovereign
put it to my okay.
inversion of yield curve. But the way the inversion of yield curve is understood in other countries is not the way we understand it here. So normally, if in other advanced economies, if there's inversion of yield curve, it's taken as a precursor of recession. For example, in US, if the yield curve is inverting, then it acts as a leading indicator for impending recession. But that is not what is the scenario in India. One, because the bond market is not that liquid, there are not that many buyers and sellers, it's not the secondary market particularly. If you are holding bonds and you are holding till maturity. So inversion of yield curve is not that much of a problem as it is in the other countries where the bond market is well developed and you have a huge side on the borrowers as well as on the investors. So what we saw as we just saw some instances of inversion and flattening, and that was mainly due to the fact that the short-term bond yields are more sensitive to monetary policy tightening, and therefore the short-term yields rose, and also due to liquidity. But overall, now we are again seeing a thing where we are moving to steepening of yield curve, and we have not seen that kind of a flattening. There have been just some instances. Whereas in the US, since for the last 2 years now, the yield curve has been inverted, where the short-term bond yields have been much higher than the long-term bond. So it's the implication of an inversion yield curve on expectation that is not something of a problem in India, mainly because of the microstructure of the bond.
Thank you. So there's a question about the investment rate being, I think your question, no? What investment being low, so Udani, implications of it.
Investment rate.
Can you come on,
So implication is like when your investment is low, so you're going to have a lower growth, you are expecting lower growth. Right? So
this force, the private investment versus government investment, this person of going to climate change.
Gross fixed capital formation is 4. Is the total of this. So overall, we see a decline.
I don't think so. Private sector is the 60-70%.
Yeah.
I think I remember because we were just working on that macro data. That's why you're asking about the current rate. So 100%. Private investment, I think, is declined. Private consumption as well as declined. So all together, and the private consumption is a big creator, biggest chunk of the creator of demand. So I'm just curious about that investment portion. What happening at that private investment right now? This current quarter, but I don't have any data.
Do you want to respond? I just want to say something.
Yeah.
I mean, the private investment cycle is not yet revived. We keep saying it's about to happen, it's about to happen. It hasn't revived. You're quite right. Private investment accounts for 60-70%. But there's been this massive thrust in public investment, as you know, as we talked about fiscal thing. And but I don't see us going back to peak rates of investment. We are approached close to 40% at one stage. It has last very long in those golden years, the beginning, first decade of this century. I don't think we are near that. And I am not certain that just the push on the government side is going to get us there. So your question is quite valid. Unless the private investment cycle really revives, and it's not yet got going, we are probably not going to see, movements to really high rates of growth, 7-8% and so on. It's showing up in the growth rates, right? It comes in, 6% is not a bad growth rate. It's a pretty good growth rate, but it's not the 8% and so on we need to become, advanced country by the middle of the century and so on.
Presently, the profit is going up. I see.
Yeah, but yet anyway, later.
One of the main reason for the moderation in private investment is also that the companies have been deleveraging. So there has been a big spurt in the deleveraging cycle. Companies have been repaying their loans. And it started not just COVID time, but even before that, because of the crackdown on bank NPAs, because of the twin balance sheet problem that was recognized and on the policy.
Because they were very leveraged earlier.
Yeah, they were leveraged and then they started repaying. So that leveraging story is a very important part of the private sector investment trajectory. That companies have repaid a lot, and now that the deleveraging has almost finished, that they have repaid their loans, because banks are also conscious they are not lending unless the deleveraging has happened. So now we are seeing that the companies' balance sheets have been much better because they have deleveraged, and that is also getting reflected in their incremental, what we call as the ICR, how much interest expenses as a share of their balance sheet side. So there also we are seeing an improvement. There was a time when ICR, which is a measure of insolvency of company, that was very low. So that has also improved. So deleveraging was a very important part to understand the fact that there was a slowdown, secular slowdown in the private investment. And now the deleveraging is over, that companies have repaid, and now a fresh cycle of borrowings needs to start, and that will have to be in consonance with what's happening to the demand condition, what's happening to the sentiments, what's happening to the policy certainty situation, what's happening to external demand. So there are a combination of factors that shall determine the private investment. But if we just look in terms of the Obicus survey, which tells us, and also looking at the sentiments, the surveys conducted by the various organizations, we are seeing some uptake, but it needs to show up in the private sector investment figures. That it will take some time, but what I'm saying is that the improvement has already started because the deleveraging is over, and there is a substantial improvement in the balance sheet quality of companies.
So you mean the industries have paid already paid?
Yes. So
here.
Yes.
So they're positioned now to get in a fresh investment cycle, but not yet happening.
Yes. Yes.
Have been paid or is write-offs. Most of the NPAs. Paid or write?
No, these are all repaid. There are write-offs which is different, but this is deleveraging.
Yeah, I understand. Write-offs is almost 60 to 70% year back.
Yeah, but these are two separate issues. Maybe I can discuss more after we are actually 20 minutes. Yeah, so you all can discuss later. I think there are two separate questions. What's the NPAs are being written off? I mean, the government, which means all of us taxpayers, are taking a huge haircut on that account. But thing about what's happening to the corporate sector is a slightly different question, but it's a long discussion, so we can carry on. But before we go to the questions from those who are attending online, Shekhar's question about NPAs and whether this is a lagged effect. I mean, the improvement we will not see. It's somewhat related to the point he is raising.
We have seen a period of strong growth in credit, not just in 2020, but we have been seeing even during the COVID time. So, if there would have been a substantial spillover of the regulatory forbearance policy, it should by now would have shown up on the NPA. So, though there are, if we look at the RBI's financial stability report, there are few quarters of stress. There is stress in MSME sector. There is some stress in the personal loan part, one segment of the personal loan segment. But overall, we see that the quality of NPAs has improved, and that is not just the present number. That if we also look at the projection that the RBI is making for what is going to happen to the NPAs in March 24, they have projected a further decline, not only in the baseline scenario but also in the adverse scenario. So, as of now, the thought process is that the NPAs would go down, and the impact of the easy credit policy will not show up in NPAs. One of the main reasons is that this time the regulatory policy, the forbearance has been much more focused on the vulnerable section, and the banks are required to be more transparent in how much forbearance they are giving, to what percentage, and what they are doing. It's not like the 2008 story when there was a blanket forbearance, so it's much more focused. That is also one of the reasons why this time around NPAs are not built.
Thanks. So we are very much behind time, half an hour, but there are two questions on the chat box which we should respond to, because I promised this, and the director has given me permission to continue a little longer, but we are in a very interesting discussion. So the first pair of questions is from Manoj Panda. His first question is the likely expansionary fiscal action towards election time Q4. This is a question for what views you have on this.
So from the data, the budget data of states as well as from the Union government budget data for 23-24, we don't see such a trend, because one, that central government have actually reduced the fiscal deficit target from 6.4 5.9%, and states are also within the FC path in aggregate. I'm talking about aggregate numbers. There may be some states which might have done, but I don't have the numbers right now. But then in aggregate, we don't see such things. But then there is again, they can always bring out a supplementary demand. So, but as far as the budget is concerned, we don't see that happening now. It's not been included in the budget, and the government continues to remain committed to fiscal consolidation.
Yeah, I think this is because compared to earlier periods, we've seen that in the last budget by election, there's already some loosening. I mean, we haven't seen that this year.
Schemes are being announced, allocations are increased to some of the.
But that hasn't happened, at least in the central government budget this year. And I recall it hasn't really happened in 2019 either. So
yes,
in the last thing. So hopefully we will not see too much. But his second question, Manoj's second question, monetary policy rate hike last year, its effects on GDP through Phillips curve kind argument. It's a very involved question. I've got my own head around it, but the question for you, Rudran.
How monetary policy tightening is going to affect the GDP inflation. That's the impact of transmission. So that is not only Phillips curve, is actually the dynamic IS curve, dynamic expectation augmented Phillips curve, and the central bank's reaction function. So that three things determine these three components determine that part. So in India, the Phillips curve. Phillips curve, what is Phillips curve? Is actually says that how your current inflation rate is determined by your expectation about your future inflation rate and your economic activity, that how much you are away from your potential level of activities. So in India, we have observed that transmission happens through this interest rate channel, bank lending channel, to some extent exchange rate channel, but the expectation channel is not present, is not working. So in these two components of the Phillips curve, so transmission happens through the interest rate channel, and that affects the your output gap, that is your deviation of output from the potential. But the expectation doesn't change too much. It's not that much aligned with RBI's policy stances. So that actually delays the transmission effect. So that's why in India we see that even if the tightening happened is in the last, so in general we see that it takes 4 quarters. So, and we also see it in the data that it happened in the last financial year, but the impacts we are seeing.
I think there's some confusion here between the Phillips curve and the Taylor rule, and so let's not too much time has been spent. Last question also came on chat box by Risha. Is rural demand is still lagging, but signs of recovery are visible? What is your assessment, and by when do you expect this recovery? Again, I think that's a question for you. Yes. Rural demand is still lagging, but signs of recovery are visible. What is your assessment, and by when do you expect this recovery?
So, rural demand, there was a period, as I have already discussed, that during the year 21-22, there has been rural demand was actually buoyant. So that drove the low end demand for goods. Now it is not that increase in rural wages are not that far, so it's not happening right now. But the overall demand picking up has been taking place. Earlier, it was during the COVID time, it was mainly concentrated on private transport and health services. But since 21-22, it spread into all different kinds of visiting services and clothing, footwear, and low-end products. So its demand has started reviving. We saw the sign of revival since 21-22, but we again see that it has declined, and there is a huge decline in consumption growth in the second half of the last financial year, which is we also expect is going to be there for a couple of quarters because of the lag transmission effect of the monetary policy or monetary tightening. But its pickup will depend on a lot of things, not just domestic factors, but also global factors, because there are global uncertainties. The global growth is lower. So all these things are going to determine the time, the lag till when we will see the private demand pick up.
You want to add something?
So on rural demand, can actually we should further refine our analysis by looking at farm rural demand and non-farm rural demand. For farm rural demand, monsoon is a big factor. Also, if we want to look at the rural demand, there are several factors like we presented about, Udhani talked about tractor sales. We can also look at two-wheeler sales. There are also, and one very important factor is what is happening to demand under Manrega. Because if there's increase of demand for work under Manrega, that signifies that there is still lack of adequate employment opportunities, and therefore they are relying on the Manrega window. So those are some of the very critical indicators. And also in terms of when do we expect this recovery, another very important factor is also food inflation, because now we are seeing that inflation is mainly, if you look at the current numbers, it's the food inflation which has picked up. So rural demand is also very sensitive to food inflation, because if food inflation is higher, it will have an impact on the discretionary demand in the rural sector.
Thank you very much. So that brings to an end this morning's very long, but I think very engaging, very interesting session. I should particularly thank those who have raised questions, apart from participating both from around the room as well as those who attended online, because I was hoping that really was an interesting part of the morning proceedings.